Welcome to Life in Red.
I almost just said it wrong. Michaela, how are you? We just talked about this before I turned on the microphone.
All good. Hello.
How
I'm
are
doing well.
you?
I'm good. How are
I'm
you?
good. Fun fact for those listening, my first in-person mental health talk, in like two and a half years, like since the pandemic started, that's where we met. So, shout out to the Canadian Mental Health Association of what was South Glengarry. It was like
Champlain East.
Yeah, so shout
Yeah.
out to them for the connection and the wonderful event and that golf tournament we were at, like a tremendous community event, raising tons of money over the years.
Yeah. Yeah. It was my first time going,
Oh,
actually. Yeah. Yeah. So my mom is a social worker and a director at Canadian Mental Health. Um, so yeah, so I was there kind of supporting them and then got to meet you through there.
yeah. So you yourself also involved in the mental health community in a capacity. You're getting your PhD in child psychology, which I
Mhm.
think is one tremendous. We know how much I think that field like is important when we're dealing with kids and adolescents growing up and dealing with sort of whether it's mental illness or trauma or other things. The work you do is critically important. What made you want to be a child psychologist? And I know that's probably a very long story, maybe it's a short story, but
Yeah.
what made you want to take on this role and responsibility?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. It might be a bit of a long-winded answer, I think. So as I mentioned, my mom is a social worker, so she worked in the mental health field for a long time, worked frontline, working with families and domestic violence specifically. And I've always been interested in working with mental health as a therapist and kind of was more interested in psychology specifically in terms of as psychologists, and again, I'm not a psychologist yet. That's what I'm training to be, but we can conduct assessments, provide diagnoses that can like better inform treatment. And I was really interested in that whole kind of process as a whole. Now, I didn't always want to be a child psychologist
Okay.
specifically. So even in my undergrad, so I did my undergrad at the University of Ottawa, and now I'm doing my PhD at the University of Ottawa as well. I always want to be a forensic psychologist, which
Oh.
is a little bit apart from child
Yeah,
psychology,
we
right?
did an episode with a
I
forensic
listened to
psychologist.
it. Yeah,
Very
still
cool.
very interested in the field. So, and I've always been into kind of true crime and all that stuff, but really interested in like the psychology of what makes a person commit these actions. Somehow, though, in all of my summer jobs and volunteering positions, I was always kind of um ended up in positions where I worked with children. So I worked in summer camps and I worked with the autism program at CHIO and always kind of ended up working with kids. And then I took a class in undergrad, which was child psychology. And I had an amazing professor. His name is Dr. Jean-François Bureau at the University of Ottawa. Still do a lot of work with him. And just the way that he spoke about attachment theory in specific and the relation between parents and children and the impact that these different relationships can have on children's development, that really just sparked an interest in me and had me kind of looking back at all of my previous experiences working with children, where I was like, oh my gosh, there is there are so many things that can contribute to child mental health, including, this family dynamic. And so that kind of sparked the interest and made me want to go more into that kind of family therapy type thing. So that's what made like contributed to the switch. Um, and so I guess, yeah, that's sort of how I ended up there, sort of volunteering for Dr. Bureau specifically, and then ended up in another lab in grad school with Dr. Erin Maloney. So she does a lot of research on math anxiety. I don't know if I should go into that specifically. Maybe I'll take a pause and see if you have any questions for me.
Yeah.
Well,
We've definitely
for
sort
sure.
of talked in a few different episodes with people who are, getting their PhD in
Yeah.
psychology and sort of the neurosciences, and talking about
Mhm.
things like, how gut bacteria and your microbiome plays into it, how trauma plays into it. But I'm curious about that attachment and sort of how that sparked your interest. And I guess
Mm.
it comes into a question of like nature and nurture,
Oh, yeah.
like
Yeah.
how, again, probably another really big, profound question, but sort of when you're learning about this stuff and you're getting interested in, how much has to do with sort of like our genetics versus how much families and parenting styles, like how much does that contribute to, I guess, how we become as adults and like issues around along the way and down the road.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, first of all, that is a big
Yeah.
question. I think we still don't have that clear answer, right? Is it nature or nature or yeah, nature or nurture? Right now we're kind of like, it's both from what we can tell. We're all born with a certain temperament, certain personality traits that are there at the base. They are part of our genetics. And that, as a result, will influence how our environment, so our families interact with us, and how we interact with our families. So there's that part. Um, so I think, like, at the base, there are things that we are born with that really contribute to our developmental trajectory. However, how parents, and no, I say parents, it can be caregivers, because not all children necessarily have parents. They have caregivers, and it can also be you know other important members or authority figures in their environment. So teachers, for example, coaches, these are all people in a child's environment that have a huge impact. And the way that they nurture children and respond to a kid's temperament can either heighten some difficulties or can kind of appease them and help them develop in kind of a different way. So just because, you're born with, whether it be a neurodevelopmental disorder like ADHD, or maybe I don't like oppositional defiance disorder. I'm not a huge fan of that title, because I think that other things can contribute to kind of those behaviors. But if you're born with kind of a more, I guess, aggressive temperament and heightened emotions, if you have a parent who is also dysregulated, not very validating of your emotions, is not tending to your emotional needs, then chances are those behaviors are just going to increase more and more. Whereas if you have a parent who can be, or caregiver or coach, who can be more attuned to a child's needs and recognize, you're feeling really frustrated right now. And I would be frustrated too if whatever the situation, if my sibling like took my toy, or if a teacher gave me a bad grade, or whatever it may be. I get that you're frustrated right now, and you're allowed to feel that emotion. Just naming that and accepting that all emotions are valid can be a huge weight lifted off of a child's shoulders when they don't understand themselves, what's going on in their internal world, right? So when you're a kid, you're so dependent on the adults around you to help you navigate that world. So if you don't have that, that's when you go on to develop some of those alternative, I guess, coping strategies, because your emotional needs were never really met at the base. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
interesting. Um, we're gonna go back in a little bit to that oppositional defiance order, but what I'm curious about, and this is something I've been thinking about a little more recently when, learning more about mental health and trauma and sort of the relationship between your childhood and how you, are as an adult. And one of the things that got me thinking is, the sort of like the classic traditional trope of, you know, I'm a parent, I know what's best for my kids. I'm not going to get you into the tiptoeing area of critiquing people's parenting,
Yes,
but
no.
no, that's
And
a
I'm not in
little,
the business of doing that
yeah.
either, by the way, working
But
with families.
what I'm
Yeah.
curious, is there known scientific differences? Because you hear a lot of sort of, I don't know if they're theories as much as just stereotypes or myths, but a difference between like whether it's an absence or neglect or, an unhealthy relationship with mothers uh, or fathers. So we're gonna just say in heteronormative relationships for now, but is there a difference, like if the way that you might respond to maybe missing like a father in your life, father
Mm.
figure or mother, like would those absences develop differently depending on what they are? Is it more in like a general, you're missing a parent and that sort of development is just more of a general sense?
Right. Okay. I get where, yeah, that's a really good question. And I'll just add a caveat to say I'm not super up to date with that
Okay.
research. However, there is research on this. Um, So if what you're asking, if we go back, so there's kind of the one question where is it more important if you get that from mom or from dad? Is that kind of one question?
Yeah, is there a difference that like, so the things that get me thinking about it, and it goes back to the conversation I just had on my last podcast, is
Mhm.
when as an example, a woman will go into sex work or something, and the immediate thought for people would be like, oh, daddy issues, right? And like the neglect of like
Right.
a father figure somehow leads to this objectification of your body, versus if you have mommy issue, right? Like that's just a very general internet
Right.
sense. But as you're developing, is there a difference between, being raised by a single father and missing your, or single mother missing your dad, single father
Mhm.
missing your mom as you develop? Like, does that change how you develop, or is it more of like a general, you're just missing a parent and like, or that a person in your life and you're gonna kind of develop doesn't really matter?
Yeah, I would tend to say that it's more, and it's not even the like you're missing the one parent. It's more like in the caregiving system, whoever your caregiver is, whether that be one parent or two parents, a mom, a dad, two moms, two dads, how is that caregiving system responding to your needs, right? So maybe, if you're using that example of, sex workers, and then you're thinking, oh, it's because they had daddy issues and they were missing a dad growing up. Okay, but what are some of the other factors that might have led this person to seek out? And I mean, it could have also been completely their choice,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
But just thinking if there are some other issues, um, what are some of the other factors that might have contributed to this person ending up in the position that they're in? Maybe part of it is that their father wasn't present, but is there maybe an abandonment issue there that wasn't completely addressed by the other caregiver, right? So you would assume that there were maybe some other issues at play within the relationship. Maybe the parent that was present was also a little bit neglectful in a way. And I'm just making assumptions,
Yeah.
right? This is one way in which this could pan out. Um, but just what I would say from the knowledge that I have is that it's not so straightforward, that this person must be in this situation because they have daddy issues, because their dad left their family. Okay, but maybe they're living below the poverty line. Maybe they're really marginalized too. And now I'm going beyond attachment as well. But there's so many other factors at play. Um, the other thing that I want to say is now I'm not super familiar with this research, but I know it exists. I know some of the common myths, especially in attachment research, is that attachment only really matters with mothers, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like moms are the primary caregivers and dads are kind of just there to be fun and play, and they're like the breadwinners of the family or whatever that may be. There's a lot more research coming out. And when I mentioned Dr. Jean-François Bureau, he does a lot of research on fatherhood and attachment to fathers and how that is equally important. And it's not just mother-child attachment that takes precedence. Now, again, I can't really speak much to that research because I'm not really involved. But just if some of your listeners are interested in some of that, that's something they can go and look into for sure.
Mm-hmm. I think one of the biggest things everyone is concerned about right now is, as we speak, we're sort of, we're in the pandemic, but a lot of people think like it's pretty much done. And for the most part, next week or even right now, most kids are going back to school for the first time with the anticipation that they will continue going to school unmasked for the most part. Most public health guidelines are, for the most part, sort of loosening up even around school and the return to school.
Mm-hmm.
And so for the first time in 2 years, a lot of these kids are going to be going back to some sort of, at least for now, a routine schedule.
Mm-hmm.
What most people are concerned about is the effects of the last 2 years, how that's had on kids and their development and their social skills and all these different things. And I know from anecdotal experience from people I've been talking to in different situations, emergency rooms are really seeing a lot more rise in like kids coming for mental health help or, in severe crisis. I know lots of people are having kids struggling. So in your field with your colleagues and the things you've seen and the things, your field is talking about, what are we seeing right now with children and sort of the effects of the last couple of years?
Yeah. Another big question.
So we're here for those
Yes,
big, profound ones.
yes. Before there was even a pandemic, there was already a youth mental health crisis on the rise, right? So what we saw then with the onset of COVID-19 is that there was it kind of exacerbated the whole crisis. And now you're seeing, if I can just speak, so one, you're talking about emergency rooms, right?
Mm-hmm.
So many visits to emerge in reason of, mental health difficulties. And when you're looking at wait lists all over in the community, the wait lists are so long or they're even closed. So you can't even get your name on a wait list to be seen because these practices are having such a hard time just keeping up, right? There's so much demand. And then you think of more, and that's in terms of kind of private practice. That's what I'm thinking of right now. But then you think of more community resources, and that's just forget about it. You won't be seen for 2-3 years, right? And by 2-3 years, I mean, that's just way too long to wait to be seen. So there's that part in terms of the crisis. And you talked about social skills and how it'll influence them socially. And that's something that I'm starting to see, actually. Even if we talk about social anxiety, for example, social anxiety is usually something that psychologists will see onset. I mean, it can be diagnosed at any age, but the onset is typically around, the teen years. Now what we're starting to see is that these traits are coming up much, much earlier on in childhood, like a 5-year-old with social anxiety, and that's because for some of their prime years, right? If you think like a 5-year-old, the pandemic hit when they were maybe 2.5, 3 years old. So they had that 2-year gap, a really important period of time developmentally where they developed that social awareness, right? And that, so theory of mind, I'm not sure if you've ever heard of that concept. So theory of mind is kind of that, I'll just give a brief description,
Hmm.
but it's that ability to kind of anticipate or know kind of what you are thinking, right? So I was actually using theory of mind right now in kind of anticipating that you probably don't know what theory of mind is,
Right.
because you're not trained in psychology necessarily, and da da da. So kids in that developmental stage, like 3, 4, 5, they start to begin to develop this ability to think like, this person might be thinking this person might be judging me for doing this, right? So that's where social anxiety comes in.
Mm.
And they haven't gotten the practice to go out and interact with other kids and with other people. So now we're kind of throwing them into the world, and they haven't had those interactions like kids normally would. And so they're developing a lot more, like they're becoming a lot more self-conscious and just not wanting to go into those situations. So that's something that we're starting to see a lot more, and that parents are really, really concerned about. And it's really sad to see. I mean, it doesn't mean that there's no treatment for it and that it can't be helped, but because it's impacting people on such a large scale, it's hard to provide everyone with the resources they need.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's one of the biggest reasons why I advocate, and, speaking and stuff can only go so far, because you're telling kids, if you need help, ask, and then
And they're
everyone's
like,
asking and there's nothing.
yeah,
And
well,
that's
they're like,
hard.
ask or they won't know, right? That's where a lot of people end up in emerge too. It's like,
Yeah.
I don't know where else to go. Or when we tell them where to go, people are like, sorry, wait lists are closed, or try this place, and they try this other place, and that place is closed too. And then they just give up. You've got kids who are already having this sense of hopelessness, if they're dealing with depression, whatever that may be, that just increases that sense of hopelessness, right? They're telling me to reach out for help, but nobody actually wants to help.
Yeah. Yeah. And then I don't know, it's just this vicious cycle. And I know just tons of kids going to emerge and being put on like Seroquel or something, or an antidepressant at like 12. And,
It's like a
you know,
band-aid solution.
yeah. And I understand those doctors are just like, this might help until this, but like, it bugs me. And this could be a whole separate conversation, that like the government be like, well, here's a phone number. Like, yo, like,
Oh, exactly. And then even when COVID started, I think, and I can speak to like Ontario specifically, there were all these things put in place because so OHIP doesn't cover mental
yeah.
health services, right? So it covers physicians, medical services, but not psychologists or other mental health professionals. And so when COVID first hit, the government did recognize that, more support was needed for mental health. Sorry, I should not, the government did not recognize that. The mental health professionals recognize that, and we're coming together and offering free services, right? But there's only so much they could do. So they could offer, maybe up to 6 free sessions to people. But the research shows that it's not up until 15 or 20 sessions that you start to really recover from whatever it is you might be living through. So even then, it's just all of these temporary
Hmm.
band-aid solutions that are not really having an impact long term.
Hmm.
And if I can add, I think I might have mentioned this to you when we met. So back on this note on the government. So mental health professionals were once upon a time, I don't remember how long ago, asked and then consulted to see, should mental health care be included under OHIP? And ultimately, and I'm saying this is not all mental health professionals that decided this, but collectively, they decided that no, they didn't want to be covered under OHIP for 2 reasons. One, because it would give too much control to the government in terms of what types of services they could provide.
Hmm.
And 2, because they wouldn't be making as much money covered under OHIP than if they were going the private route. And I don't know how you feel hearing that, but that doesn't sit super well with me. Like I still have kind of shivers
Yeah.
or goosebumps when I mention it, right? When somebody first told me that and I was kind of digging into it, I was like, what do you mean? What do you mean? You'd still be making enough money to live, Like how much money do you need?
Yeah.
Um, yeah.
It's a hard one to hear, and I think I have an old friend and who's a lot older than I am, but his wife is a child psychologist, and you do hard work, and you as a do hard work. You pay a lot of money for that education. It's heavy, it weighs on you. So I believe that yes, you deserve to be compensated much better than the average. I think you should be paid well. But to hear, like, I don't know what the level would have been under OHIP. Like if like if you're making 100 but now you can make 200, or
Yeah.
it's hard to make a complete judgment. But to hear
I
that
agree. Yeah.
when so many people are in need, but like, then we could run into the program, like the problem that we have now, where we still don't have enough.
That's
Still don't
the
have
other
enough,
that
right?
was
Like,
the other problem. Yeah.
so
Yeah.
if you
What's
make
the
it free,
solution,
we
right?
still don't have people to help. So
Yeah.
everyone would be on wait list. So
Yeah.
like that is not a
Yeah.
great, I mean, it's a solution and can alleviate, especially for those who are in very, like who are in, lower income or, racialized backgrounds, like those people who really could use the help is a great thing. But for like everything, it could potentially make it even worse.
Exactly. And that was the next thing I was going to say, right? Is we have these questions around accessibility of services in terms of, um, the people who are the people who can't be seen in more kind of community settings or hospital settings. Either don't receive services or they can go the private route if they can afford it. And that was something that hit me whenever I heard you speak. Was you mentioned something like, one of the things that people can do to take care of their mental health is go to therapy if you can afford it. And that just like stuck with me because that's one of the things that I tell myself all the time. It's just not fair, right? That not
Mm-hmm.
everybody can have access to mental health services. And like you said, already we're struggling to provide services to everyone who needs it. So I don't know that necessarily making it more accessible right now. I think we still should make it
Mm-hmm.
more accessible, in the sense that I don't think it should come out of the client's pockets to pay for services. And it doesn't solve the problem that there's just not enough mental health professionals right now who can address all of the needs of our society. And I don't have an answer on how to rectify
I
that,
think if
right?
we did, we'd be fixing it. It's,
Yeah.
I
And
mean,
there are,
really, it's incentivizing people to get into the profession, whether it's sort of like what we are with nurses and teachers, like we pay for their
yeah,
school.
yeah,
We just make it so much. It's tricky because you can't make it too easy because like not everybody
we
could do
still want
it.
quality
Yeah,
services.
like this is a really important job, but like just breaking down the barriers, I'm sure there's lots of people who would love to do it and they just can't afford the schooling. And I think that like that's one answer, but I mean, I'd be, in a higher position if I could figure it all out.
Yeah, I know. And there are things that I start to think about too. I'm like, oh, what about if we offered more groups, right? So
Mm-hmm.
then you just target a whole lot of people at once. And being a part of a group as opposed to just individual therapy can provide a lot of benefits as well. You feel kind of this sense of community and belonging with others around you who are going through the same things as you are. You realize you're not alone. And then it's easier also, if a psychologist or a psychotherapist is offering this,
Mm-hmm.
and decides to offer it pro bono, right? So you can offer it pro bono to multiple people at once rather than several individual pro
Mm-hmm.
bono cases. So you're not losing that much of your own livelihood. So that could be one way. And then I know another thing that you had mentioned at one point was social media as well, like
Yep.
raising awareness through social media, which I think has its advantages and disadvantages as well,
Yeah.
right? So
There's
yeah.
it's sort of like in a way it becomes that group therapy that you said, like it's not facilitated by a professional, but at least you have people online who sort of like at least empathize and get it, and it becomes that sort of like pure mentorship, pure guided support, which is lovely, right? I've made tons of friends from around the world because of this. So there's absolutely, I love that solution, but you're right. Like social media isn't exactly like a safe place, and
Yeah.
opening yourself up online, you know, can lead to, bad outcomes, especially for Black folks, indigenous folks, women, LGBTQ people. Like, it's one thing for me as a straight white man to do it, but like it also for all those folks opens up a whole can of worms that can, jeopardize your safety. And so you got to think about that as well. So again, not a great solution, but something that can help in the right setting.
Yeah, that's the thing. It's so tough, right? And I know I really need to get on TikTok. I'm not on TikTok yet, and working with kids and teens, I always ask
Yeah,
myself, I'm not on it yet.
it's a
Sometimes I'll
weird
talk to me
place.
about these things. I've heard.
A great place, but it can
Yeah,
get weird and
yeah, that's
bad
why I'm
really
kind of
fast.
reluctant of getting on it. And I feel like it would be professionally a wise decision to be informed and know what my clients are talking about. But I know that on TikTok, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, because again, I'm not on it. But there's kind of this rise in people kind of sharing their own experiences with different diagnoses they've received. So like ADHD, autism, I've heard like borderline personality
Yeah.
disorder come up as
BPD. Yeah.
well. ADD, yeah. So they'll start kind of sharing that. And then it's kind of like, how we tell people don't start, Googling your symptoms
Mm-hmm.
because it'll just confirm that you have like a brain tumor or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like that's sort of the same thing that's happening here, where it sounds a lot like, what the individual or the teen is experiencing, but it's not being shared. It's an anecdotal kind of story. It's not being shared by a professional. And a lot of misconceptions can be formed. And it's possible that, if let's say I was a teen and I see this and someone starts talking about, um, their symptoms of depression and how they're having such a hard time concentrating, they're tired all the time, all of these different things. And then I'm just convinced that, oh my gosh, maybe I'm depressed too. And that
Mm-hmm.
can be so great because it can be so validating, and just see that other people go through this and there's things to do. But we also know that thyroid issues can contribute to, extreme fatigue and lack of concentration and all these things. So you're potentially missing out on something else because you've just kind of confirmed and zoned in on some of these things. So it can be potentially dangerous at the same time, right? And I'm not saying that people should stop doing that, because like I said, there's a lot of benefits to it too. I just think that it's hard with kids and teens, because they don't quite know yet how to pick out that information, and take it with a grain of salt.
Yeah.
Right. They're really important conversations as well.
It's something I've talked about and thought about a lot too, the self-diagnosis on social media, especially TikTok. And you see it commonly with things like autism,
Yeah.
ADHD for
Yeah.
sure. Like there's a lot of people, and OCD. Those are three common ones
Yes.
I see a lot. And
Yeah.
I'm gonna set aside the discourse and the dialogue around it that you would typically see in the comment section or people resharing videos, because that in and of itself can be incredibly confusing and toxic, because there's people calling each other out and saying it's not real, or it's this or it's that. Setting all that aside, which is dangerous enough, you know you're right. These people, and I've even thought about it too, like watching people talk about ADHD. I'm like, God, do I have ADHD? Like, what? Sounds a lot like me in ways. But I think in the search of what we all do, and especially young people on social media, that you're trying to find your lane, your identity, your avenue, trying to discover who you are. And when you see this thing, you're like, oh, that sounds like me. And then you sort of like develop this personality around it. You also see it with chronic like chronic pain, like you're chronically pain and then therefore disabled. And again, not to discredit any of these people, because I know there is mistrust with the medical community, again, especially with women and Black people, indigenous, like people of color, that doctors aren't always the greatest at listening to their symptoms and pain and all that stuff. So not to discredit it, but you're right that it can be potentially dangerous to be self-diagnosing off of a creator or this trend on TikTok. Which I don't know, it can lead you down these different paths that might not be particularly good for you physically or mentally.
Well, exactly. Yeah. And you mentioned chronic pain. So my husband's a physiotherapist. So this is something we talk about a lot, like kind of the intersection between, like physical pain and mental illness
Mm-hmm.
as well. And things that you end up seeing with chronic pain and, depression or anxiety, especially if you're not followed by a professional, is that you end up kind of building your whole identity around that. And then you end up losing yourself within that and creating kind of this, again, I'm going to come back to this sense of hope. So yes, it can be validating for them to be like, okay, there might be something going on that explains why I'm feeling this way. And also they might just create their whole kind of personality and world around that, and forgetting that there are all these other parts to them that contribute to them as a whole person as well. And I don't want to use the word, I'm not even going to use that word. We're going to backtrack. But yeah, no, I just think it can be unfortunate sometimes, because they can kind of develop this idea that there's nothing, they're just like this, and there's not necessarily anything that can help. And that's something that you see a lot with chronic pain and depression too. And some, not always with anxiety, but I've seen it happen.
Yeah, I put a lot of work in over the years to not be defined by my mental illness, especially like because I speak about it publicly and that I do all these things. Like I don't want to just be known as Ryan, the depressed, anxious guy, right? Like I'm like, there's other aspects to me that I think are important. And it's taken a lot to try to work against my mindset, because especially because that advocacy is so validating and encouraging, and I get a lot of praise for it, and it's very gratifying. But like, if I don't want to limit myself on saying I can never get fully better or healed or all those things either.
Yeah.
And so it's like it's a tricky little mind game you work on through therapy
Yeah.
to not do it.
Yeah.
I did want to touch on, because it sort of relates to this conversation about social media, but you mentioned there was, even before COVID, a rising sort of mental health crisis within like kids and teens. What do you think we're seeing sort of contributes to that? Because I know for a fact social media does contribute to it in
Yeah.
ways. Talk about Instagram and the rise in body, like eating disorders and everything, because of the body dysmorphia and stuff that the women, young girls, are experiencing with things like Instagram, and even men to an extent. So I mean, we can talk more about the social media aspect, but are there other factors that you believe were contributing to this sort of this rise and this crisis within kids?
Yeah, and I think, well, I think you really hit the nail on the head with the social media piece. That's for sure a huge contributing factor. And then the other piece that I would say, that I don't know if it is specifically to kids and teens or just to everyone, is sort of this grind culture
Mm.
that we have, and this societal pressure that we have to meet these high, almost unachievable and unrealistic expectations at all times. And you can think of like the teens in school who are supposed to be part of like the student government and be like excelling in sports, excelling in school, deciding at 17 years old what they want to be when they're older, just all of this additional pressure that just seems to be, it was always there, but it just seems to be more. And I don't know if social media has something to do to contribute to that pressure, but I think that that's also a big influential factor in what we're seeing.
I've thought about, and social media also plays into this, but I'm 30, and I assume you're around that age, maybe a little bit younger, but when we were growing up, we were sort of a little bit older when social media and all this instant information and news and being accessible all the time
Mhm,
is
mhm.
it came when we were a little bit older. We weren't as young, but now we have kids, 3, 4, 5, who can navigate YouTube, and they're growing up in an age where they know, if they wanted to or by mistake, like, everything that's sort of happening in the world, in a way, like you're always aware of what's happening
Yeah.
in Yemen or
Yeah.
China or Ukraine, or right now, with the in Ethiopia and the Tigray people.
Mhm,
There's always so much to know. And then we
mhm.
talk about pandemic and the things that are happening domestically and inflation, blah, 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 blah.
Yeah.
you know
I know. I'm like, oh, yeah.
yeah, like I could just keep going the rest of the
Yeah.
podcast and name everything. And so I wonder, because our generation, we had 9/11 and then the 2008 crash, and we sort of grown up with this collective trauma in a way that I think it's like,
Mhm.
is the world a great place? And I'm not saying
Yeah.
other generations did, but now especially, like, it's hard. It's really hard to have hope. It's hard to have hope for me. And
Yeah.
I have tools, and I talk to people, and I can conceptualize and put things in context. So I'm wondering, how much do you think just the world and knowing about it is affecting kids, because they're finding out about all this stuff when they're like 7, they're 6.
I
Like, I didn't
know.
have the emotional or intellectual capacity to understand any of it.
No. And like you said, because of social media, at that time when we were that age or when our parents were kind of growing up, even if, I would argue that bad things were still happening in the
Yep.
world. A lot of bad things were still happening in the world, in the 90s, 80s, 70s, keep going back.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I don't know if there was necessarily less bad things going on, but we weren't reminded of it every single day. You open your phone, you go on Twitter, you go on Facebook, Instagram less. It's a little bit of a like fantasy world on
Yeah.
Instagram, I would argue. But you're just constantly bombarded with those messages. And so I think that that's what creates that sense of just almost dread, and the world is such a bad place because you are just reminded of it every single day, right? You almost can't escape it unless you didn't have technology or you didn't have a phone, and then that's not the solution because you're cutting yourself off from the world socially. And like you said, that information, what's going on in the world, is not digestible for children. And our society almost has to adapt and find a way to explain these things in a developmentally appropriate way to kids that's not too much information, but also not no information to the point that they're like, well, I know something is going on and now you're just hiding stuff from me. And it creates this sense of mistrust with
Mm-hmm.
the world. Right. So it's a really thin, like, kind of tough place to be. Um, I don't know them off the top of my head, but I know there's a lot of like children's books and stuff coming out to kind of facilitate this discussion for parents and teachers on how to talk to their kids about, the news in the world and everything that's going on in a more digestible and developmentally appropriate way. The name escapes me now, of course, but there are those resources out there for parents.
We've talked a lot about issues and problems, and rightly so. And I think a lot of people are probably wondering at this point and just in their regular day life, if my child or a kid in my life that I know is struggling, like, what more can we do if I can't bring them to the hospital? How can we prevent in ways crisis? What more can we do? Again, in the theme of just asking big questions, what are maybe 1, 2, 3 simple things, everyday things, things that are easy to grasp that people with a child in their life, whether it's parental, grandkids, brothers and sisters, like, what can we do more of or better to support kids who might be going through some sort of mental health crisis or struggle?
Well, the first part is, and it might sound simple, but talk to your kids, right? Don't shy away from that conversation. It can be so easy and more instinctive for not just parents, but anybody who knows someone who's going through something difficult, to kind of invalidate those emotions or just shut down any conversations that might involve big emotions that we don't quite understand or feel comfortable with or even agree with, right? So if you have a kid who's feeling really anxious or really sad, but they live in a big house and have a lot of friends and have all of these things to be grateful for, it can be so easy for a parent to just be like, no, you're okay, you're fine, like, don't cry, you have nothing to be sad about, look at all the great things you have around you. And that might be true. And imagine, Ryan, if you're feeling super sad and you know that you have all these fantastic things around you, just we're putting aside all the things that are going on in the world right now, and then someone tells you, you don't have a reason to be sad, just like be grateful, right? How would
That's my
that make you
story. That's my story. And not even other people telling me knowing. And yet
feel?
I still can't explain why
And
I
then it
like don't want
ends
to be
up you're,
here.
well, what is wrong with me, right? That I'm feeling so down on myself when I shouldn't be, right? And like shoulding all over yourself I don't know about you, but it's my biggest enemy,
Mm-hmm.
is always being like, I should be like this or I should do that, right? But sometimes just having someone tell you like, I'm noticing that you seem really sad right now, and it's okay for you to feel that way. Do you want to talk about it? I'm here if you want to talk about it, or I'm here if you'd like a distraction. Let's watch a movie or something, and just kind of give the space to your child to share as much or as little as they want, and let them know that what they're feeling is okay. My biggest message is that all emotions are valid, right? You can be angry, you can be sad, you can be happy, you can be anxious. It doesn't necessarily mean that all behaviors are okay, right? You can't always act on your emotions, but what you're feeling is always okay. That's your
Mm-hmm.
reality, right? And having someone tell you that you shouldn't feel that way, or having yourself tell yourself that you shouldn't feel that way, usually doesn't really help you in any
Mm-hmm.
way.
I
So
had this
just,
yeah,
yeah, go ahead.
I had this conversation with my therapist actually because we were talking about anger.
Mm,
And
mm,
as a man, you only see anger like when you see people angry, especially in like pop culture and TV, right? It's very violent, it's angry, it's
mm,
yelling, it's
mhm.
punching, it's smashing, it's throwing things. It's like this very like dramatic outburst. Like that's what anger is supposed to look like. Even like that's how it's depicted, right? And then I kind of asked my therapist, it's like, well, then what's the right healthy way to be angry? Because anger is an emotion that we're all going to experience, and that's fine, it's valid. But like, how do you actually display or deal with anger in a healthy way? And I was like, I don't actually know, other than to sort of try to avoid it.
Yeah.
Like I'll
Yeah.
go take a walk, which is a healthier way of dealing with it. But like, I don't know if I've acknowledged it. Like, I'm like, I'm angry, I need to take a break.
Mhm.
And I think a lot of people might struggle with, especially anger. Like, we know when we're sad, we cry. We know when we're happy, we smile and laugh. But when we're angry, what do
It's
we
like, what
do,
do
and
you
what's
do?
healthy?
Yeah, and it's almost like, I would say it's just finding ways to redirect that anger, whether it be go like punch a punching bag, right? Like you like release all of that pent up energy that you have with that anger. If it is anger that's kind of at the base, because sometimes anger can be, you can think of the tip of the iceberg where, you see the anger and the behaviors associated to anger, but then underneath there's maybe other, especially for men, because you talked about men, right? So anger is usually a more socially acceptable emotion for men to
Yeah.
express than is sadness and anxiety. Those are maybe a little bit more vulnerable emotions. So sometimes anger replaces those underlying emotions. So if you're
Mm,
a man or a woman that is kind of experiencing this anger, but not really understanding where it comes from, um, it might take a little bit of digging, right? And self exploration and seeing, like, is there something else kind of like under that iceberg that might be contributing to those feelings of anger?
yeah, that's very interesting. Another
Mm-hmm.
great thing to think about. Why, yeah, you have to acknowledge why you're angry, and yeah, what's making you that way? What's the
Mm-hmm.
trigger, or what's
Yeah.
the it's a whole different thing. Um, I'm curious, like, what are some of the things you worry about in particular? I'm not going to go as far as to say like keep you up at night, but when it comes to your field and your practice and the things
Mm.
you're seeing or the things you foresee, what are some of those things that, like, you think about a lot when it comes to
Mhm.
this?
Yeah. Well, we already touched on this a little bit, but accessibility of services.
Yeah.
That is the thing that keeps me up at night. And I don't know if it's being, so I've just finished, so as you mentioned, I'm a PhD student in clinical psychology, specializing in child and family psychology, which means we do kind of placements and different rotations. So I'm just finishing up a rotation in a private practice. Which I really loved because of the flexibility. And I also really struggled with because of needing to charge patients for services, right? And it's not so much that I was charging those clients because I knew that they could afford it, right? They were here, they can afford it. But every time I would charge a client for that one session, I would think of all of the other families who can't access these services, not because of wait lists, we'll put that on the back burner. That's a
Hmm.
whole other problem, but because they can't afford it, right? And so that's something that I really, really, really struggle with in this field. And I'm trying to find ways to rectify,
Hmm.
and I don't have the answer at the moment.
And oftentimes,
No.
not to discredit any family struggle, because it's all valid and important, but you think about lower income or vulnerable groups and families, they often come from situations or backgrounds with intergenerational trauma or family abuse or addiction or, crime. Like, there's just so many factors that just like complicate things and like accelerates the need for help. And when you're talking about healing and community healing, you know, how much good could be done if the government were to redirect tremendous resources into helping these families and these people help themselves and help their families and help their community. It's just like it bugs the shit out of me too,
Yeah.
because the
Yeah.
world could be so much better. And you want to talk about, you know, um, societal harm or, colonialism harm. Like, it just goes back so far. It's like
Yeah. I think I
we
read something like, I'm sorry to cut you off,
no,
but I read
please.
something, Indigenous peoples are, or youth specifically, are something like 5 to 6 times more
Yeah.
likely to die by suicide than other populations. And I'll be honest with you, in my practice, and again, just to cover my own butt, my clients are technically my supervisors, who's a registered psychologist clients. But in the people who I have seen, I've never seen an Indigenous person in ever, right? So like these people are 5 to 6 times more likely to die by suicide, and they're clearly not receiving services. Or if they go to emerge, for example, they're probably kind of disregarded or
Yeah.
discharged really quickly, and they're not properly assessed and they're not properly redirected to the services that they might need. So it's really, really discouraging, and it just seems like such a huge systemic issue to start tackling. It's overwhelming to even think
Uh,
about. So there are things that I'm like, okay, what is my role in all of this? Like, how can I help, and how can I take steps to
yeah.
improve our system?
And it's so hard as like someone who cares and empathizes, it's like can't put the weight and the pressure of solving that issue, because like we have people who are supposed to be doing that, but you want to help. And we talk about accessibility, and I think in a large sense we're talking, wait lists and everything for city services. We haven't even mentioned rural. Canada is a vast place with very few cities. And you want to talk about, Indigenous regions, or Northern Ontario or Alberta, Saskatchewan. Like there are so many communities like that can't even find a family doctor, let alone a
Yeah.
mental health professional. It just, I sit here and I talk to people like you who are so educated and passionate, and I sit there like, how can Trudeau or premiers or any MP or MPP sit there and say they're doing a good job when we have so much of this happening and so many people without care? It just, like, if I would let it eat me up, if it's incredibly frustrating.
Yeah, it's a lot. And I try to not take it all on and see what is my part. If everyone in the world could just like tackle one small
Yeah.
thing, what could that be? So I try to think of it more in that way, and also just in speaking about it to other people, so that hopefully that instills some passion in them too, to like take a small step towards change. Um, so for me, I don't have the answers yet. I'm still a student, still trying to figure it out. But I hope that we can continue to kind of have these conversations, and figuring out what our small part can
Hmm.
be in that change.
Before I let you go, I do want to give you an opportunity to maybe dispel some misconceptions or myths. I know we talked about oppositional defiance order.
Mm.
Um, what are some things that are on your mind that people might not understand or have a misconception about? Why don't we take some time to get some stuff off your mind and be like, no, like this is not it. Like this is what's happening. This is the real thing. So, I mean, take it wherever you'd like to go.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, there's a lot I could talk about. You mentioned ODD being one of them, and this might be, I mean, I think that our field is a little bit split on this opinion. I just find that ODD is kind of a label that people place on quote unquote bad children, who can't regulate their behaviors and who are just these, little devils. And like, but I also think that, one, I don't think there's any such thing as a bad child, right? A child doesn't act badly because they want to be bad. They act badly because it's the only way that they can get their caregiver or an authority figure to meet their need in a certain way. And that could simply be getting attention from them, right? And they've learned that through bad behavior, they can get attention from their parents. And there's usually a lot of other things that could contribute to ODD, and it's not always. I want to preface this by saying it's not always, but oftentimes we can see that people who have been diagnosed with ODD have some sort of a history of trauma, right? So a lot of the behaviors that they've developed are actually coping techniques, right? Or ways to kind of meet their needs that are not necessarily super adaptive or healthy behaviors, but they're just how they've ensured we think like kind of from an evolutionary perspective, I'm getting all like the tongue twister. But if we think of that perspective, it's really to ensure their survival at the base, right? To get their caregivers to pay attention to them and to do something that they need for them, right? And then they just end up kind of responding that way in all environments. I can explain, do we have time for me to explain a little bit of how that plays out?
Absolutely.
So if you think of what, when someone experiences trauma, right, it's like a shock to their nervous system. And I can talk about trauma in terms of a single traumatic event or multiple threats to their caregiving system. So it can be that, they didn't have a consistent home environment. Maybe they jumped from foster care to foster care. It could be that they lived in an abusive household. And when I talk about abuse, it could be physical abuse, could be sexual abuse. I think those are the biggest ones that we think about when we think of abuse, but it could also be verbal abuse or emotional abuse or neglect, right? Their basic needs aren't met. They're not always being fed consistently or clothed consistently. So when you live multiple kind of repeated incidents of this, your system kind of adapts in a way where you're always kind of looking out for threat, right? Because by being super sensitive to threat evolutionarily, that's how you can ensure your survival, because you can respond to that threat. And I'm not sure how familiar you are with the fight or flight system, right? So just for your listeners, so if you think flight, you're faced with a danger and your response is to kind of, did I say fight or flight? I forget which part. Flight. So if you think flight, you run away, right? Get away from that danger as fast as you can, or just avoid as much as you can. If you think fight, you're going to attack, right? And you think, how does that play out with kids? That's where you see like kind of the junk talk. They might say really mean things. They might be really, really aggressive towards you. But that's kind of their trauma response, right? And then there's also the freeze, where they kind of don't do anything, right? So like if you think of animals, like they could kind of just play dead, right? There's kind of no response, but it's still, they're still engaged and aware that they're doing this. Whereas if you think shutdown state, that's where you're just dissociated from. So these are all a bunch of different trauma responses that you can have. With ODD, what we tend to see is that fight, that aggression, those mean words, not doing what they're supposed to do type thing. And usually when you look at kind of the background history of some of these people, or, what kind of triggers these behaviors, it's all in response to some sort of perceived threat. So we might look at that as being benign, like a teacher raising their voice or someone making a request. But for kids who are so highly sensitive to these different things in their environment, it doesn't take much for them to, I'm going to say flip their lid. So I'll go back and explain. So I have all these concepts and then I'm like, I have to go back to explain so you can follow what I'm saying. So you can think of your brain, and for your viewers, I'm showing like a hand model, and my thumb under here, this is like your more emotional brain, your limbic system, right? So this is where like that aggression, that anger, that highly like emotional state is situated. And then on top, you have your prefrontal cortex. So this is your more rational and thinking brain. This allows you to make decisions, to think before you act. But for people who have experienced a trauma, who have a much lower threshold for threat, their lid flips. So their prefrontal cortex and their emotions become disconnected. So they no longer have access to kind of their rational thoughts, which is why it's really hard for them to kind of control those behaviors, right? And it's only by providing them with kind of a consistent and caring and loving environment that you can eventually build up that threshold so that they're not so quick to flip their lid in situations that they could potentially perceive as threatening. So that's why I don't super like the diagnosis of ODD, is because I find that sometimes it can, but it doesn't always get at the root of the problem.
That is so fascinating. Oh my God. Very interesting.
I went kind of back and forth between different terms. I'm so used to talking about these things with my colleagues.
Yeah.
So I'm like, yeah, their lid is flipped. And now I'm like,
No, you
don't
did
know
a
what
great
I'm talking
job.
about.
It perfectly illustrated. I'm like following
Yeah.
along, just so intrigued. Just I can't really speak about it here. I'll tell you after, but just so
Yeah.
intrigued about that whole thing. So thank you for sharing that.
Yeah. And for people who are interested, so that whole hand model of the brain. So this is Daniel Siegel, who I believe is a psychiatrist. He has a really good book called The Whole Brain Child. And it's really, really interesting to understand how, children's brains work and how it impacts their behaviors and what parents can do in response to that. And I found even myself reading it's really helpful for adults as well, right? Because this applies to everyone, not just kids.
One explains a lot why some adults are like the way they are, because they've never, how many people have never dealt with the things that they've experienced and been through in any sort of healthy way.
Yeah. And how much more empathy and compassion does that generate in people when you understand, right? If I see someone who's like kind of quick to react or quick to respond, I'm like, oh man, their lid is flipped, like they haven't learned how to regulate those emotions. It's not their fault, right? They're probably not doing that because they want to be malicious, so just you come to understand the world in a much more, I guess, compassionate.
That's how I've learned to deal with social media and like comments. And so I'm like, you can never say it because that can come across very condescendingly or.
Exactly. You would never. I would never go to someone and be like, excuse me, sir, I think your lid is flipped. But you kind of think to yourself, like,
this
man, like
this person's lashing out because harm has been done. And that's why they're doing what they're doing. It's like, oh, okay. Yeah, no, that was absolutely fascinating. This was really great. I'm so glad we connected and you came up to say hello after my speech with your mom, because this was just a tremendous conversation. So intelligent, so articulate. And when do you get to become, doctor? Still more to go.
Yeah, I'm going into my 5th year.
Oh my goodness.
I think it's a long process, about one more year before I defend my thesis. And then I'll have to go off to internship, write my licensing exam.
Heavens.
Stay tuned.
Wow. Well, we'll have to connect again down the line when you're a doctor and your thesis is defended. And no, this was really great. Thank you so much for all this.
Thanks for having me. Yeah, I feel like I just learned from you too, and just hearing you speak about certain topics.
I give a chance, and I almost forgot to plug. So I don't know I know you said you're not on TikTok, but if you have website or bookings or information that you share, plug whatever you'd like to plug right now.
Yeah. So you can find me on Twitter. My oh my God, I don't even know what my Twitter handle is actually. That's embarrassing. Let me just check. It is, so it's DiStefano, DISTEFANO_MG. So you'll find me on there, probably talking about some more academic related stuff. Otherwise, maybe one day I'll be on TikTok. So look
It's
out,
big.
world.
It's big. I love therapy talk. I
Yeah.
learned so much. It's great.
Yeah. So Twitter is where you can find me primarily.
Wonderful. Michaela, thank you so much. This was great.
Thank you.